Welcome to you all to the Politics of Race in Global Perspective, Mark Q. Sawyer Memorial Symposium. So last night we started with a roundtable that was spirited and heartfelt. And today, over this next day, what we're gonna do is have a number of panels and roundtables that will have us go a little more deeper and get more critically engaged in the institutional and intellectual contributions that Mark made and continues to make in academia and beyond. So today's day is scheduled around panels that include scholars, a diverse set of scholars, many of whom were personal friends, mentees, and mentors of Mark, and also interlocutors directly and indirectly. I think everyone here today, including a lot of you that are in the audience, embody the kind of radical work that Mark did in his life and that we continue to benefit from, right? Work that goes beyond simple binaries and beyond nationally contained boundaries, work that pushes us to think more critically about racialization, work that builds institutions and reconfigures institutions, and scholars that move us towards more engaged scholarship. So I'd like to thank everyone who's here and everyone who is going to participate today in the symposium. This first panel is called Political Crisis in the Americas, and I'd like to hand it over to Michael Dawson, who will be moderating this panel. Thank you so much.
Hello. Thank you, Tianna. And I want to once again thank the organizers, the Center's International House, for bringing us together for this important event. Mark was centrally concerned in his activism and political activities and his scholarship with racial equality in the United States, and was passionate about politics within the U.S. And that's the topic of this panel, racial inequality and the political crisis in the U.S. I have, in Americas, I have argued that we are, for particularly some populations in the U.S., in the midst of a legitimacy crisis. As the promises of that capitalism made in the 20th century, the privileges of white supremacy and patriarchy are no longer fulfilling the needs of the great majority of the U.S. Now, I would also argue that for many populations of color, there's not really a legitimacy crisis, it's normality. We're in a period of, once again, extended economic deprivation and various other types of repressive policy aimed at our communities, both aimed at citizens and non-citizens, which was, of course, a central aspect of Mark's work. Our distinguished panel today will address these questions within the context of the U.S. and the Americas more generally. Each panelist will have, in theory, 15 minutes. And we'll try to keep relatively on schedule, so there's plenty of time for discussion. Our first panelist, you know quite well already, is Tianna Paschel, an associate professor in the Department of African American Studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her work is interested in the intersection of racial ideology, politics, and globalization in Latin America. Her work can be found in the American Journal of Sociology, the Du Bois Review, Souls, Ethnic and Racial Studies in various edited volumes. She's also the author of, as we heard yesterday, the multiple award-winning Becoming Black Political Subjects, which draws on ethnographic and archival methods to explore the shift in the 1990s from ideals of unmarked universal citizenship to multicultural citizenship regimes and the recognition of specific rights for Black populations by Latin American states. Our second speaker will be Alfonso Gonzalez, an associate professor in the Department of Ethnic Studies at the University of California, Riverside. He received his PhD in political science from UCLA and an MA in Latin American Studies from Stanford University. Professor Gonzalez is a theorist of Latino and Latin American politics with a research agenda focused on issues of migration control, human rights, migrant social movements, and the politics of race in the US, Mexico, and Central America. His research is in simultaneous dialogue with scholarly debates in Latino politics, political theory, Latino and Latin American studies, and critical ethnic studies. His underlying concern is to show how Latino, migrant, and refugee social movements influenced policy and the politics of migration control from the ground up. Gonzalez is the author of the award-winning Reform Without Justice, Latino and Migrant Politics in the Homeland Security State, published by Oxford University Press in 2013. Our third speaker is Ming Francis, an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Washington. Francis specializes in the study of American politics, race, and development of constitutional law. Francis received her MA and PhD in politics from Princeton University. She is particularly interested in the construction of rights and citizenship, Black political activism, and the post-Civil War South. She is the author of the award-winning book, Civil Rights: The Making of the Modern American State, 2014. This book tells the story of how the early campaign against state-sanctioned racial violence of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, shaped the modern civil rights movement. Francis is currently at work on a second book project that examines the role of the criminal justice system in building of Southern political and economic power after the Civil War. She's also the national co-director of the Race and Capitalism Project. Let's welcome our panel, and we'll start with Professor Paschel.
Thank you so much, Michael. So in some ways, this is kind of the most difficult presentation I've ever tried to prepare for. And in other ways, it's actually the easiest because Mark influenced my life and my work kind of through and through. And I think the best way to show Mark's influence on me is actually just to continue to do the work. So what I'll present today is some of my thinking about my book, but also kind of post-book, and really channeling Mark to think critically about how the current moment of economic and political crises in much of Latin America calls us to rethink the multicultural turn and what we have so far conceptualized as gains in Black rights over the last 3 decades. So in 1991, Black farmers and miners left Colombia's Pacific coast, making their way to the capital city of Bogotá. They took with them marimbas, or xylophones, drums, and songs about rural life and culture to the National Constituent Assembly, with the intention of serenading the delegates there. And these serenatas served one purpose: to prove to those elected to draft Colombia's constitution that Black communities should be granted specific rights by the state. Ultimately, they succeeded, and they were recognized alongside indigenous peoples in the country's 1991 constitution as a distinct ethnic group whose rights to collective territory, among other things, were legally protected. So Colombia's neighbor, Brazil, had reformed its constitution along similar lines just 3 years before, recognizing the cultural and territorial rights for quilombolas, or escaped slave communities, or runaway slave communities. However, that country's more transformative ethno-racial reforms came about a decade later with this wave of policies designed to promote racial equality. So in August of 2001, Afro-Brazilians flew to South Africa for the UN Third World Conference Against Racism as part of the second largest delegation there. In contrast to Afro-Colombians, who carried with them symbols of culture, Afro-Brazilians traveled to Durban equipped with official statistics on racial inequality and on discrimination in their country. They had one main objective too: to pressure the Brazilian state to grant reparations in the form of affirmative action. In December of that same year, then President Cardoso gave an historic speech in which he stated the following, quote, "The Brazilian state recognizes the painful consequences that slavery caused in Brazil, and it will continue with the task of repairing such damage through policies that promote equal opportunity," unquote. He added that the best way to address this issue was through both universal and affirmative action policies for Afro-descendants. Subsequently, a number of unparalleled reforms were implemented throughout Brazil, including affirmative action in many of Brazil's most prestigious public universities. So in both Colombia, oh shoot, am I advancing this but not, oh, you're with me, I love that. Okay, so in both Colombia and Brazil, these political changes presented a serious rupture in state discourses that had denied the existence of racism and which downplayed the cultural heterogeneity of their countries for nearly a century. And nationalist narratives in both were built on this idea of mestizaje, or the notion that biological mixture and cultural hybridity between Europeans, indigenous peoples, and African peoples had given way to racially egalitarian and homogenous societies. And as such, the official state discourse in both Colombia and in Brazil was that they had somehow overcome their sordid histories of both slavery and colonization to create racial paradises of sorts. And there was some truth to this. Relative to other regions, Latin America had experienced much less ethnic conflict. There was much more social integration, and ethnic identity seemed to be less salient in everyday life and in politics. Thank you. Nevertheless, there were still clear patterns of ethno-racial inequality, histories of forced cultural assimilation, and symbolic hierarchies that continued to privilege Europeanness above both indigeneity and blackness. And those who critiqued this de facto racial order were sometimes repressed by the state, but more often they were simply dismissed, accused of importing racism from elsewhere, of being unpatriotic. And this is one of the aspects of the reproduction of racial inequality and racial hierarchies that Mark's work so brilliantly exposed in the case of Cuba, but I think the theory goes beyond that case. So it's particularly surprising when in the late 1980s, Latin American governments began to initiate this puzzling shift to multicultural legislation. And these reforms recognize the multi-ethnic nature of these societies, but they also were about material things, right? The redistribution of land through collective land rights, the rights to natural resources, alternative development, and political participation. And other reforms included criminalizing racism, affirmative action policies, not just in universities, but also in public sector jobs, and in some cases in Congress. So how do we explain this monumental shift? So in my book, I analyze this shift to specific policies for Black populations. I first asked why in the 1980s and 1990s did the Colombian and Brazilian states go from these kind of formal citizenship regimes based on ideas of this kind of unmarked and universal citizen to the recognition of Black rights specifically. Second, I asked what kind of Black political subjects became institutionalized in these cases. And the final question I ask is, what are the consequences of the adoption of ethno-racial policies here? And I'm gonna focus on this last question in this presentation because I think it's the most timely one that's happened. And it's the one that I think I hear Mark's voice mostly when I think about what those consequences might be. So to answer the question in the book, I use ethnographic methods to show the ways in which the institutionalization of Black rights has really reconfigured the very movements that I argue brought them about. And I also show how they have reconfigured state bureaucracies, right, in limited ways, but I think in important ways. I also show how recent gains by Black movements have catalyzed reactionary movements determined to undermine Black rights. So in June of 2007, Brazil's widest circulating magazine, and its most influential one, featured a cover with the title, "Race Does Not Exist." As you can see here, it features the light brown-skinned identical twins, Alex and Alan Teixeira da Cunha. Both twins had applied to be considered under the affirmative action policy at the University of Brasilia, one of the 3 universities that use self-identification as a criteria for admissions, but instead of just self-identification, they also had this panel that determined racial classification, which made it particularly infamous in the landscape of affirmative action there. So you're probably familiar with some of this case, perhaps, because it reached the US or English media, because one of the twins was admitted and the other was not, right? So the issue of, this issue of Beja was dedicated almost entirely to expose the dangers of affirmative action programs and what they call the myth of race. More interesting, in addition to publishing the story of the twins, the edition also featured a large spread of pictures of famous Brazilians. Alongside each picture was a pie chart, as you can see here, with each person's genetic makeup broken down by percentages. Famous musician Djavan, 65% African, 30% European, 4.9% American. Olympian gymnast Daiane dos Santos, 40.8% European, 39.7% African, 19.5% American, just to name a few. The point of this exercise, one might conclude, was to show that all Brazilians were mixed, and as such, the idea of discrete racial categories was a fiction. It followed then that affirmative action policies made no sense in a Brazilian context. Nevertheless, all of this rested on the implicit assumption that a strictly biological definition of race was the only possible way that race could be defined. In contrast, UNIB's policies, the University of Brasilia's policies, even while they relied on this panel evaluation of racial identification, did not operate with the biological notion of race in mind, but rather a social one aimed at correcting historic racial discrimination. Ironically, what actually made Veja's feature so compelling was its underlying premise. Even in the Brazilian context of racial fluidity and ambiguity, all of the people that they chose to feature were considered socially Black in Brazil. It was precisely this disconnect between the social and the biological ideas of race that made these famous Brazilians an interesting story to tell, right? A gap that may have compelled someone to say, oh, Tianna is only 39.7% African. That was the fact that this was actually a story at all. Another irony was that by having these famous Brazilians tested for their so-called racial makeup, and also by publishing the results, Veja had effectively endorsed the idea that races were indeed biological. In fact, it was easy to conclude from this issue that races were real and discrete, and that Brazilians were made of a knowable mixture of these clearly identifiable races. Of course, reproducing racialism was exactly the opposite of what they intended to do in their famous race does not exist issue. But in my book and in my larger work, I argue that this was part of a broader and a particularly contentious debate in Brazilian media and society that was brought on by these policies themselves, but also by this emergent reactionary movement that calls itself the anti-racialism movement. Indeed, just a year before, a letter addressed the Congress entitled, "Everyone Has Equal Rights in the Democratic Republic." And it began to circulate in Brazilian newspapers, transnational listservs, and on the internet. 114 people had signed the letter, including public intellectuals such as social scientist Simone Schwartzman, the former First Lady of Brazil, UChicago, as well as one of Brazil's most revered musicians, Caetano Veloso. At the time the letter was released, almost about a fourth of Brazil's 87 public universities had already adopted some form of affirmative action. Even so, the debates around these policies was intensifying. And Brazil's Congress was considering voting on the statute of racial equality, as well as this law of quotas, which were introduced many years before. And both pieces of legislation proposed to introduce affirmative action at the federal level. So the letter received great visibility when it was published in its entirety in the Folha de São Paulo, Brazil's widest circulating newspaper. Folha also became central to and emblematic of the ideological contestation over racial policy in Brazil. It gave a platform to these debates. And one of the interesting aspects of this kind of emergent movement against racial policies in Brazil is that it echoes a lot and also foreshadows a lot of what is happening in the US today under Trump. So you see all this language of like people being the real patriots. You see other language of like always, it's like Fox News probably invokes Martin Luther King more than the left does. And so there's all these kind of scripts that seem to be moving throughout the Americas that I think are particularly interesting rhetorical devices and also divisive tactics, right? So while affirmative action and other racial equality policies have not been completely undermined, their fate remains really unclear. The backlash to racial equality policy, I argue, acted as fuel in the recent protests calling for the impeachment of Dilma Rousseff from the Workers' Party. In this sense, the recent impeachment should be read not just as an indictment of the Workers' Party's social policies, right? The Bolsa Familia, the Fome Zero, and other policies, but also of its racial equality policies. And in fact, many of the repertoires of action that we saw in these protests against affirmative action, you see on the streets against the Workers' Party protests a couple of years later. And of course, I probably don't need to say that things are like vanishing very fast, these racial equality policies that were so important to my book and so important to the movements that brought them about. Just to give one example is, as I was driving in my car listening to NPR, which happens a lot, I hear, Brazil's interim government abolishes 7 federal ministries. And of course, I know that if it does that the Ministry for Racial Equality is actually going to be on the chopping block. And surely enough, it's been reconfigured and downsized in ways that are really disturbing given how limited it was to begin with. So throughout Latin America, what has emerged in the aftermath of ethno-reactionary movements of all kinds, devoted primarily to dismantle these policies. So in Brazil, as I've talked a little bit about here, the politics of backlash took the form of elite and grassroots movements against affirmative action, supported by mainstream media conglomerates and backed by public intellectuals like Demetrio Magnoli, Ivani Magui, and Peter Fry. Also throughout the region, from Colombia to Honduras to Ecuador to Brazil, small and large white landowners and transnational corporations, especially extractivist mining corporations, have sought to, through legal and extra-legal means, undermine land rights, indigenous and Black land rights throughout the region. So the recent disturbing events in Brazil and beyond over the last few years have had me rereading Mark's work and thinking about Mark a lot. So I've been thinking again about his theory of race cycles, right? He argues that, quote, mechanisms like state crisis, transnational politics, and critical events lead to transformations in racial politics. However, these transformations are followed by the process of state consolidation, which relies on racial ideology to limit and ultimately halt any gains made as a result of this mechanism, unquote. He adds that the mechanisms that drive the change trend toward an equilibrium position of stagnation in the racial situation. So I think this is one of the main opportunities, contributions in Mark's work, but I also think it's one of the main tensions in his work, right? And arguably in my own, right? Which is to think about how we want to characterize the kinds of change that happens among racial states, right? And particularly the kind of change that's catalyzed by social movements. Should we think about these as terms? Should we think about these as cycles? What is new about these new equilibriums? And to kind of theorize what is substantively different, if there is, about these previous racial moments and racial orders. Does the state consolidation that follows gains in racial equality ultimately undo everything that came before it, or is there no going back? Is it fundamentally a different stage that we're in, right? And more fundamentally, what is progress when it comes to racial equality, right? So while my work focuses on the monumental nature of ethno-racial policies in Latin America, I also show that there are profound limitations. The racial equality bureaucracy that was set up was embarrassingly underfunded, and we actually have someone who worked for CEPIR, the Federal Ministry of Brazil, in the audience, and could probably tell you a lot about that. They had relatively very little power if you compare them to other federal ministries. And questions of anti-Black state violence that was so central to the Black movement since the beginning in Brazil were never on the table with these recent reforms. And this is despite the fact that the disproportionate killing of Black people by the police were discussed in the Durban conference. They've been discussed in the Black movement since the beginning of the 20th century and arguably before. So with Mark's critical lens in mind, my new project tries to go even further to parse out these questions by turning to the amorphous space of racial ideology, to think through the ways that the institutionalization of Black rights may be reconfiguring the common sense about race and inequality in the region, in everything from print media to advertising to television, to how ordinary people talk about race and talk about themselves on the streets and in taxi cabs in these countries. So I'm doing this, and with doing this, my hope is to think more precisely about what we actually call racial ideology, and to think about how it gets diffused, how it gets challenged, how it gets reproduced. Hey, Ali, it's so good to see you. And to move toward even more rigorous methodologies that capture what racial ideology is, right? I think that this was one of Mark's many missions, and I see it as one of my own, and continue in that work. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Professor Gonzalez.
Well, I shouldn't have used red, I knew it. But the title of my talk is Trumpism, Authoritarian Neoliberalism, and Subaltern Latino Politics. I was a Mark Sawyer student. I finished my PhD in 2008. I think you'll see the influences of Mark in my work, and I'll end with that as well. But this talk is basically an analysis of the current conjuncture. Do I have a clicker up here? Yeah. It's not working. Okay, you want to just advance with me? So the talk is really an analysis of how do we understand the current conjuncture with Trump. And you know, at the beginning, when Trump first gets elected, there's a lot of talk about the end of neoliberalism. And there was this really short piece, more like an op-ed that Cornel West put out, and he writes, the neoliberal era has ended with the neo-fascist bang. And I definitely think that we're in a new era, but I don't know, and I don't think, in fact, I'll argue that we're not at the end of neoliberalism, but under a new configuration of a neoliberal racial state. So the research questions that I advanced, this is actually an article that just came out in Islam, the Journal of Chicano Studies, special issue on Latino politics and Trump. It was the only piece done by a theorist. So the research question is, you know, how do we really explain the rise of Donald Trump? And most importantly, what does this mean for Latino politics research? What does this mean? What are the implications for people on the ground? Next, please. And part of what I'll argue, and this is what I got from Mark, is that traditional Latino politics research is really can't answer these questions. It really, if you look at the special issue on Trump, it's all, you know, a bunch of regressions that show us that, you know, how Latinos voted, public opinion. Latinos think that Trump is racist. I mean, it's very traditional American politics research. Although I respect that work, and I've been trained in REP, I mean, it was political theory and REP is my field. I think to ask these questions, we have to think beyond just the traditional sphere of government, right? We can't just study elections, public opinion, political behavior. We got to really understand something about capitalism. We got to understand something about civil society, the power of ideas, and because of that, I work with Gramsci. I work with Stuart Hall. I work with, in fact, one of the first book that Mark gave me was Michael Hancher's Orpheus and Power, and that was an extremely influential book for me to think about, well, how do we use Gramsci to understand the politics of race, and understand the politics of social movements. And if we want to understand the rise of Trump, we got to think about the evolution of neoliberalism and what we call the neoliberal era. It really starts in the 70s, and then we're still in it today. It's just been reconfigured. I think the difference is, however, from the 80s, if you think of the World Bank loans, structural adjustment programs, start with Mexico 1982, and then go to Colombia, to El Salvador, Dominican Republic, these trade agreements all rested on consensual forms of domination. They all rested on the myth or the argument that neoliberalism was going to bring about democratization. In fact, the terminology in the 1990s was that of market democracies in Latin America. The Clintons love to talk about market democracies. But what we see happening is a move away from the consensual part of neoliberalism, right? The idea that we could win democratic support for these ideas, or that neoliberalism will bring about democracy, that's evaporating all over Latino America and Central America and Mexico. And in the US, I would say that what Trump represents is not the end of neoliberalism, but a reconfiguration towards a more authoritarian neoliberalism that relies less on consent and relies more heavily on coercion. And what are the five major components of this? One is a corporate takeover of the key institutions of government. I mean, Rex Tillerson, well, until recently, Rex Tillerson. That's the hard thing about writing about Trump, is that you can't really talk about his staff, his cabinet without them being gone the next day. But a direct corporate takeover of key institutions of government. I mean, our foreign policy was headed by an oil executive. Our educational policies headed by someone directly from the 1%. Second is a reconfiguration of the state to a more repressive entity through the buildup of prisons, police institutions, along with the general militarization of society. The third component is a curtailing of civil liberties and civil rights protections in the name of order and national security. This is really important. I was talking last night with a colleague about this, and People think about neoliberal restructuring as just like privatizations, the selling of state industries, or letting the market do the work of the state. But it's also part of the neoliberal racial reconfiguration is also undoing the civil rights protections, undoing of the Voting Rights Act, undoing lawsuits that were won in the 80s by Haitian and Central American asylum seekers that give refugees just a little bit of protection. All these are being undone in the courts. This is part of the racial and neoliberal reconfiguration of the state towards a more repressive entity. The fourth component of this is the criminalization of social protest and the growing anti-intellectualism. The anti-intellectualism is so important. So many of my colleagues have received hate mail. So many of my colleagues have been threatened. One colleague, he has people following him, who's a student of Mark as well, in fact. He has people following him, taking pictures of him and his 8-year-old daughter, sending him pictures. I mean, and especially Black and Latino intellectuals have been targeted by this anti-intellectual terrorism that's coming from these right-wing sectors. And it's really, really a hallmark of authoritarian governments all over Latin America and in Europe is the attacks on intellectuals. The fifth component is a shift in the racial politics from so-called colorblind racism towards a resurgent white nationalism that seeks to dismantle rights regimes and programs won by racial minorities, indigenous people, women, LGBT communities, immigrants, and refugees. The resurgent white nationalism is partial to this authoritarian neoliberal reconfiguration of the state. It has historic parallels. I don't want to get caught up in the game of saying is it fascist or non-fascist. I know what a lot of the Latino activists in Los Angeles, we've gotten to this whole debate, like just call it fascism. I'm like, well, it's not as easy as just calling it fascism. But I think that if we really want to understand what's happening today, we got to think about 20th century fascism and do recognize that there is certain important parallels. The first thing we need to understand is that fascism was a response to the crisis of capital accumulation, to the classic era of liberalism. After the crash after the Great Depression, you have rightist strategies for defeating the left all over Europe. Similar to what we see today is rightist strategies for crushing the left all over the US and Latin America, even in Canada, in Mexico. So it is part of this global right-wing reaction to crisis. The other important thing that we have to remember is that authoritarians of different varieties, including fascists, they seek to create a constitutional crisis in which they can basically suspend elements of liberal democracy. And as problematic as liberal democracy has been for people of color, when it's completely suspended, that's when the dogs come. And they seek to suspend it and they create these states of exception in multiple places. In fact, the states of exception exist in multiple spaces. Another classic element is the unification of social classes via extreme nationalism, war, and major events. That's precisely the strategy of this extreme white nationalism, right? To transcend class, right? This is why the white working class is such a base for authoritarians like Trump, but also they were all over Europe and all over Latin America in the 21st and 20th century. Again, like I sort of mentioned, this is a global phenomenon. We saw this in Latino America in the 30s with Maximiliano Hernandez Martinez in El Salvador. What my colleague Raul Moreno would say was the longest fascist regime in history, lasted 70 years. We saw this with Trujillo in Dominican Republic. We saw this with Somoza. You saw these authoritarian governments emerge out of this crisis of capitalism. We're seeing this authoritarian return of the right in Latin America, precisely out of the crisis of neoliberalism. In the context of the US, I think we have to definitely look at Trumpism as a response to major people of color movements. So Christopher Chase Dunn, who's a world systems guy, he gave us analysis on Trump and the authoritarian turn, and it was really good, but he said, well, the difference is that in Europe there was a real communist left, and in the US we don't have a left. And I'm like, no, we have a left, it's just not the left that you want to see. It's not the Workers' Party of the German Workers' Party. It's through social movements, right? You completely missed these major movements. And of course, There's Black Lives Matter and other black social movements. There's Standing Rock. There's the immigrant rights movement. These movements represent advancements for people of color, but at the same time, they create fear in mainstream America, right? So the authoritarian response is precisely to these movements, right? This is why Trump's messages of law and order resonate with a certain sector of the population. The other important element is the return of eugenics to the center of mainstream American politics, and I just can't express how dangerous and sickening the return of eugenics to U.S. immigration policy. I mean, in my first book, Reform Without Justice, I wrote about how groups like Federation for Immigration Reform, Center for Immigration Studies, how their founders basically had these eugenicist ideas around immigration and race in the United States. But in the 80s, these people were on the margins. Today, they are literally in the White House. They are literally in the Department of Homeland Security. They are literally advising the president, advising Congress on immigration policy in ways that seemed unimaginable even 20 years ago, even 15 years ago. So what have been the major policy shifts that have come out of this, out of Trump's immigration policy? A lot of folks focus on deportations and they say, well, the deportation numbers are not as high as they were under Obama yet. And you can't just look at the deportation numbers, and I was definitely critical of Obama, and me and Mark had many debates on Facebook about this. And we all know that Mark he defended Obama a lot of things, but you can't just look at the deportation numbers, right? In fairness, the deportation under Obama was a product of the buildup of a Homeland Security state from the 1990s moving forward. Obama didn't do all of that. And there was I do work in immigration court in ethnographic work, but also practice. If you look at the practices in immigration court under Obama and now, it's totally different. It's much more draconian now. So if you look at what are the major policy shifts, right? So you have a canceling of DACA, a canceling of TPS for Haitians, Hondurans, Salvadorans, in another group, I'm forgetting the fourth group. You have 2,000 new DHS officers, 5,000 new Border Patrol agents, 500 more military personnel, expansion of the wall, the end of prosecutorial discretion. This is where I was going out with the immigration court. So before an immigration court, if you were a Haitian or a Honduran in immigration court and you had no criminal record, under the Obama administration, the DHS might say, well, sir, you have your 2 children here, you have no criminal record. We're gonna push pause on your deportation. We're gonna exercise discretion and we're not gonna deport you. There was roughly about 2,000 prosecutorial discretions per month. Under the Trump administration, they got rid of prosecutorial discretion. So now, if you're like a dreamer, or you're a mother or father with no criminal record, they don't care. They're going to deport you anyways. In fact, what I've seen through my ethnographic work and my practice is I've seen plenty of young people that would normally be considered dreamers in immigration detention, in the actual centers, in the jumpsuits, in immigration court. There is no more prosecutorial discretion. You have an expansion of the detention space. The current plans of the Trump administration, right now we hold around 40,000 people per day in migrant detention. They're building the infrastructure to move towards 200,000 people per day in migrant detention. And the Supreme Court just basically ruled that migrants and refugees can be held indefinitely in immigration court. They're not necessarily they don't have necessarily the right to a bond. Next, you can skip that. So what I've been seeing in just to kind of move a little bit to my current work, I've been working on my second book with Oxford. It's called Dead on Arrival: Mexican and Central American Asylum Claims in the Authoritarian Neoliberal Era. And what I've really been seeing is these practices in immigration court, where you have thousands of Mexicans, Central Americans, and Haitians in these detentions. And you're seeing people just be railroaded. It's called dead on arrival is because 97% of Salvadoran cases lose. 99% of Haitian cases lose. I mean, only 1% of Haitians are winning their immigration, their asylum claims right now. And we're being held in the same detention centers. So in Adelanto, California, the second largest group after Latinos are going to be Haitians. And it's really interesting to see the Latino and Haitian organizing happening in Adelanto. So in Adelanto, you had hunger strikes that were at first called Central American hunger strikes. Well, ironically, when the Central Americans went on hunger strike back in March of 2016, when they went on hunger strike, the leaders got sent to the hole, the hole, the chute, right? Solitary confinement, thank you. So when they're in solitary confinement, who's in solitary confinement? Haitians. And one of the Haitian leaders, interestingly enough, the Haitians that are in Adelanto, they were in Brazil. These are Haitians that went to Brazil first, okay? And they were there working around the Olympics, working around the World Cup, because there was a need for cheap labor. And these folks had left Brazil, crossed all of South America, all of Central America, through Mexico, tried applying for asylum at the U.S.-Mexico border, and get detained with these Central Americans and Mexicans too. But ironically, a lot of the Haitians spoke Spanish. And one of the Haitian leaders, he spoke Haitian Creole, he spoke Brazilian Portuguese, and he spoke Spanish. So when they're in solitary confinement, he's talking with the Central Americans about their asylum claims, how they're all losing, how they're being railroaded in immigration court. And the Mexicanos, I'm Mexican, I wish I could say that we joined. The Mexicans didn't join the Central Americans on the hunger strike, but the Haitians did. This Haitian leader who spoke multiple languages was a bridge between the Central Americans and the Haitians. So then in Adelanto, you start seeing Haitian and Central American hunger strikes and organizing happening in the entrails of the Homeland Security state, in the deepest levels of this police apparatus. You can't get no deeper than solitary confinement. You start to see this solidarity organizing happen. Can you go back real quick? One of the interesting elements, if you look at this, the Adelanto Bond Fund, this flyer has Honduran flag, Haitian flag, and Salvadoran flag. And there was a really interesting movement that emerged in Los Angeles. I think it's really important, especially in the context of Black and Latino solidarity, but also the ideas around anti-Blackness and Black pessimism, and the ideas that some of the ideas that are out there that there really can be no unity, there really can be no, there is organizing on the ground. I think intellectuals can make that argument, but on the ground, in the most oppressive sites of state power, you see this organizing happening, and it has an impact on society, and also in the intellectual production. So my good colleague and friend, Jemima Pierre, for instance, an anthropologist at UCLA, she's been writing about the Haitian organizing, Haitian and Central American organizing, and also doing a lot of work on the ground as an activist as well. So part of what I do and what we're moving towards is a different way of doing Latino politics research that we call Subaltern Latino politics research. And it's very much influenced by Gramsci, but also influenced by Mark Sawyer, right? Mark would love that, huh? It's influenced by Gramsci and Mark. And there's many elements to this, but basically it's we got a book series with Oxford University Press. It's the first book series on Latino politics with Oxford. And we wanted to distinguish ourselves from the traditional Latino politics research, the kind of work that Gary Segura, Luis Fraga, or Matt Barreto does, for instance. There's venues for that, and it's important work. But we wanted to have a venue for doing Latino politics research that was theoretical and that was qualitative. So we wrote this proposal, and the proposal was approved, and we have 2 manuscripts coming out very soon. But what are the elements of subaltern Latino politics research? The subaltern part is really important. One is the conscious break with traditional Latino politics research. Second, it's the focus on the subaltern Latinos, because not all Latinos are subaltern, right? So for Gramsci's understanding of subaltern, people, that gets misconstrued. People always associate subaltern with post-colonial studies. And indeed, Spivak and Guha used subaltern, but where did they get subaltern from? They got it from Gramsci. And it's really an intersectional term to talk about multiple levels of marginality. And for Gramsci, the people on the margins of society, the margins of state of rights regimes, the people on the margins of power were absolutely central to the building of a successful left. You cannot have a successful left if you don't bring in the subaltern, the folks from the South, as Gramsci would say, and as Stuart Hall interpreted in his important essay on Gramsci that Mark also introduced me to, Gramsci and the Southern Question. So we focus on subaltern Latinos, the Latinos on the margins, Afro-Latinos, queer Latinos, indigenous Latinos. These are the politics of these groups, and these groups don't necessarily work with the Center for American Progress. They don't work with the Democratic Party. They're organizing in places like Adelanto. They're organizing in the hoods in San Bernardino and Oakland, right? They are on the margins of power, but without studying them and taking them serious in our research agenda, we're not going to understand how politics is operating on the ground. The third thing we're trying to do is create opportunities for scholars who are producing theoretical, qualitative, and transnational work. Again, Latino politics, for the most part, is focused on the US. The organizing, the political work happening on the ground is not just the US. When I talk to you, for instance, about the Haitians in Central America is organizing in Adelanto, you gotta talk about Brazil, you gotta talk about Honduras, you gotta talk about El Salvador. That doesn't fit in traditional Latino politics work. And again, that's very, the influences of Mark to have his hemisphere perspective. And then the most important thing is that our scholarship and pedagogical practices be committed to producing counter-hegemonic work at the intersection of political theory, Latino politics, Latino and Latin American studies. That's the direction that I'm moving in my work, but me and my colleague Ray Rocco at UCLA, that we're doing this with this series because we believe that if there's going to be political advancements on the ground, there has to be intellectual space for thinking about politics in ways that can't be confined to traditional Latino politics research. Next, please. So I just want to thank the organizers of the conference, and I have a major debt with Mark Sawyer. If you knew Mark, if you knew me, we had a very tumultuous relationship. I love Mark. Mark turned me into a scholar when I was an activist. I was an organizer. I was an immigrant rights organizer in Los Angeles. And I learned from Mark, he influenced me to think hemispherically. Now that I think about it, Mark introduced an entire generation of Latinos to the Black radical intellectual tradition. And I see it, especially here being in Chicago, I'm like, wait a minute, I know all these people because of Mark. And that influenced our intellectual work, not just myself, but an entire generation of Latino PhD students coming out of UCLA. Rocco was obviously a major, Rocco and Mark Sawyer, they mentored a generation of us together, but Mark brought important things. If it wasn't for Mark, I would have never read Stuart Hall, I would have never read Paul Gilroy, I would have never known who Michael Hanchard was, and I'd be talking about Gramsci just using the same old white Gramsci that I always talk about Gramsci. And that, I can thank Mark for having that influence, not just on me, but on many of us. The other thing that Mark taught me is how to be a good advisor, a good mentor. Mark had tough love with me because I I wanted to be an organizer more than I wanted to be a scholar. But Mark saw that I indeed had what it takes to become a scholar. So Mark's strategy with me was to pull away and just kind of let me go and organize, but he probably thought I was going to organize myself out of academia into just an organizing job. But he pushed me, he gave me the tools to become a scholar. So all of the work that I do today is deeply indebted with Mark Sawyer and his mentors as well. They had a major impact on him and his family. Chicago, the South Side, I realized all of these institutions had a major impact on this man who in turn brought that to Los Angeles, a place that's very Chicano, very Mexican, it's very Central American, but Central Americans have a hard time because of the Chicano hegemony that sort of exists in Los Angeles. And Mark helped break that, and he opened our minds, and we're seeing that today, not just in our scholarship, but also our administrative work. I'm the director of the Latin American Studies program at UCR. We have three major components to our program: critical indigenous studies, and anti-blackness in the Americas, and LGBT and women's rights, gender and sexuality politics Those are the three components of our Latin American Studies program. It's a Latin American Studies program of the subaltern, or from this subaltern perspective. I wouldn't be that type of Latin American if it hadn't been for Mark. I think I would have, even if I would have just stayed at UCLA, I'd probably be doing just work on Los Angeles, on Southern California. So I can thank Mark for that as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Professor Francis?
All right, we're going to try to do the same thing, I think. Cool. All right, good morning, everyone. First, I really want to thank the organizers, the family and friends of Mark Sawyer for being here today. I'm going to begin my research presentation with a bit of a story. So I'm not as familiar with Mark as the other panelists are. But for me, Mark's influence, like many people, I probably would not still be here in the academy without different examples of ways to do political science. So he's had a tremendous influence on me. I want to actually, instead of, I know you closed with the wonderful story of Mark, I'm going to start off with a story about Mark's influence on my graduate school career and then in my first job. So I did, and this is probably speaking to a lot of graduate students here, not here, but in general. I did my graduate work at Princeton University. I hated it. I was going to leave after 2 years. There wasn't interesting work at all around race and politics. And so I spent my third year after I finished coursework in the Bay Area, and then I came back, and Melissa Harris Perry was there. And in that year, though, of being out in the Bay Area, I just read books that I thought were interesting, right? And through these books, I began to see a different way to do political science, a way to do race that was outside of survey research behavioral approaches to political science, a ways that valued a kind of a mixed methods, interviewing different people, and also historical approaches. When I came back to Princeton and I met Melissa, and she learned of my interest, she was like, "Oh, you know what book you need to read?" And I was like, "What book do I need to read?" She was like, "You need to pick up Racial Politics in Post-Revolutionary Cuba." And I was like, "Well, I don't do Cuba." She was like, "I don't care. You need to read this book. It's interesting, it's nuanced, and this could be possibly the future of race and political science." So I went, and actually this morning, I looked at, it has my Amazon history. It says that in September of 2006, I bought this book. And when I bought this book, it was exciting for me because it was a type of work, again, focused in a different context, but very much took race politics, took theory seriously. And for me, especially as somebody, and I'll explain a little bit about this, as somebody who really utilizes history in their approach to political science, it's a way in which, at least to me, use the history of oppressed peoples and kind of rethought political and also legal development. All right, don't advance yet. One more story. So my orientation in political science, I do constitutional law and American political and constitutional development. I'm interested in the development of the American political and legal system. And so for me, I've told this story, and I'll explain the first book in my presentation today, about the NAACP's campaign against racial violence in the first quarter of the 20th century. And I finished up at Princeton, nobody wanted to hire me. It was 2008, it was Obama's America, we were post-racial. So political science was like, no, they're like, racial violence, that's crazy. So anyways, I was fortunate, I got two postdocs. My first postdoc was here, actually. And then I got my first job 2 years later at Pepperdine University in LA. And I went out there, and I had no community at Pepperdine. Nobody was doing race work there. And so naturally, people were like, you know who you should reach out to is Mark Sawyer. He's at UCLA, and he's super connected and interesting. And I know his history, knew his history from being at University of Chicago. And so unlike Alfredo, I emailed him, and he emailed me back. And he was like, welcome to LA, well, let's get you plugged in. I'll send you some stuff that's going on at UCLA. We'll bring you into the fold. And for me, at trying to find intellectual community in LA, he was fantastic and great. It also was that my very first talk in LA. It's because he was like, you know what, we got to bring you for a research presentation about your dissertation project at UCLA. And I was like, oh, that'd be so. So we organized it, and he came, my very good friend Yuri McMillan came, and Lori came, and I think that was it. Maybe there was like one other person, right? But I was so excited. He was so engaged with my work. And he asked these questions that I'll never forget, because I often have given job talks, and I have rude people in the audience ask me, this is history, why are you here? Why don't you just go to a history department? And first off, I don't think that's bad. I love history departments, right? So, but like, I'm like, you know. So anyway, so he asked that question actually, and I was like, I wasn't prepared for Mark Sawyer to ask me this question about. He's like, why not go down, go down the hall and present this in history department? Why are you in political science? Do you think that political science can actually like embrace history in the way in which you want it to? And I was like, and I paused for this moment. And it was this back and forth with me, and I was like, I made the case, and I was like, no, I think and I really believe that political science like can do this, and it can be better, and I want to be a part of that. And he was like, okay, and he seemed somewhat satisfied. But that's just two stories to say that I really appreciated Mark's focus on history, his dedication to students, especially that came out of the Chicago tradition. I did a postdoc, so I was like, somewhat okay and clear. And he was like, you cool with Kathy and Michael? Okay, all right, we're gonna look out for you. So he said, I still, to this day, very much think about his influence being at UCLA at the same time that I was at Pepperdine, as well as finding his book at a really important time. All right, so, forward. Oh, wow, that was great. Magic. All right, so, what I'm going to present in the time that I have left is a bit about my first book project and thinking about political equality in the Americas and my historical work. My book came out in 2014. He saw, and what I presented in front of him at UCLA twice were earlier versions of it. And so I've really been interested in this question about how might we understand the ability of Black political actors in an earlier time in American political history to shift political and legal institutions. In the subfield of American political development, it's expanded very much our understanding of a number of important issues in American politics, such as bureaucratization, party development, and social policy formation. However, there's an important understudied area that necessitates, I believe, greater attention, and it's that APD scholars, that's our term for American political development, has not sufficiently examined how civil rights organizations have contested the boundaries of the American states. And so one of the things I do here is trying to understand, it's become at some level, my book, a longer history, or part of a longer history, obviously, of movements to protect Black lives. And so obviously there's been much more attention in the past 4 and 5 years on civil rights organizing and movement organization and mobilization around the protection of Black lives. What I often tell my students in particular is that struggle is a much, much longer struggle, right? And that we need to always understand that history and the ways in which individuals on the margins push against political and legal institutions and the ways in which states and or governments also push back. All right, next slide. All right, you can just do this, the next thing. There we go. All right, so I was interested in looking at using archival methods in my dissertation work, and in obviously this what became my first book project. I started with the NAACP. I planned to tell a different story, write a different story than the one that I wrote. For me, before I went into the archives, my advisors told me it's okay if the archives lead you in a different direction. I was like, no, it's not okay. I plan to tell a story about the NAACP and how they missed and looked past criminal procedure and criminal justice in the so-called post-civil rights era, and that's it. I didn't know nothing. So I began, and so I actually also did not know the appropriate way to do archival research. I began my archival work in the NAACP when they began, which was 1909, and I just read. And I just read and I read and I read. And what became, or at least what unfolded for me, was a different story. And so I approach the archives with an understanding of what is termed, right, this hegemonic education organization focused on education. However, in the era before Brown v. Board of Education, scholars and Black leaders were rethinking a range of different strategies to approach Black liberation and Black freedom. And I think it's important to understand that the structure and the expertise of the NAACP that allowed it to play the role that it did in the Brown era of civil rights was determined by a series of earlier events that set it down that path. I think it's important oftentimes when we look at rights movements to understand which struggles were pursued and also which strategies were left behind. All right, next slide. For me, the most fascinating aspect in terms of just reading the NAACP archives in the beginning 2 decades was that I, in all my legal work, public law work, and political science, had heard the story, the case Moore v. Dempsey. It's the first case in modern criminal procedure, and it's it's a case that happens in Phillips County, Arkansas, after a race massacre in 1919. And what happens here is that African Americans are organizing, African American sharecroppers are organizing about how to get fair wages out of the white landowners. Whites find out about this, they fire shots into the meeting. Basically, this is in so many ways, right, a labor meeting. And then what happens then is the white authorities in Phillips County, Arkansas, they basically burn the Black section of town down and they shoot African American men, women, and children. What happens afterwards is that African Americans are blamed. 12 African American men are sentenced to die by the electric chair in a courtroom that is dominated by a mob. It gets appealed up to the Supreme Court in 1923, and we know this case, those of us in legal history, as the first case in modern criminal procedure, because before this case, the federal government, federal courts were not involved in state criminal court trials. And so Moore v. Dempsey is the first case in which the federal courts begin to say, okay, in this case, the decision was that mob-dominated trials violate the due process clause of the 14th Amendment. Right? But this is the first case in which federal courts are like, all right, we're going to get involved in state criminal court trials, and we're going to try to figure out what's just and what's not just, right? And so we know a number of different changes happen in the 30s, 40s, and then of course in the 60s and the 70s around kind of the modern, what is termed the modern criminal procedure revolution. This story is told without Black people in all the law books. It's as if, and it's this fascinating story in its way that it's told, it's that the Supreme Court had no choice but to decide this case in this manner, right? The facts of this case were just so egregious and so racist, right? That these Supreme Court justices had to basically go and protect these Black men. All right, so this case, again, decided in 1923, and it never sat well with me. I was like, I don't really know. I just feel like, right, civil rights law litigation happened decades later. Anyways, so in the first, so what began unfolding in the NAACP documents was that they were all over this case. They investigated it, they funded it, they litigated it. It was 2 times denied a hearing before the Supreme Court, and that it was the NAACP's work that actually forced the Supreme Court to decide this case in this manner. And I thought this is an interesting and important story that needs to be told. Just a quick thing here also about APD. So much of APD and thinking about how do political and legal institutions change over time, so much of it emphasizes the actions of political elites and governing institutions. Indeed, so many of the field-defining books in APD center on top-down change, right? And for example, again, the Progressive Era, the New Deal. But institutions, I think it's important to understand, do not act in a vacuum. Meaningful political development is also the product of bottom-up protest and the contestation that happens between those on the margins and those in power. Studying, I think, American political development in this era, right, which is very much kind of the Black Lives Matter era, I think necessitates a deeper engagement with the histories of racially marginalized groups, and a focus on what some scholars have termed as state building from the margins. All right, so that's the jacket of my book. Okay. All right, so There's these three big questions I think that the book takes up, but essentially I'm really trying to understand what is the role of African American political actors in the early part of the 20th century to shift legal institutions, political but very much legal institutions, right? How were they able to shift federal court power in this period before we tend to think that African Americans are active on the national level in politics? And so one of the things that I also want to talk about and or think about, and this is also something that is influenced by Mark's work and other scholars as well, is that oftentimes I get a question around, well, why didn't we know about the story before? And I think that as scholars who do work around politics and law, we need to be attentive to the power dynamics that are ever present in our craft, especially those of us who do historical work, in terms of thinking about what archives, what papers are actually preserved over time, the libraries get to hold what papers, and so all of that I think matters in terms of retelling specific stories of political and legal development. All right, next. No, you can skip this one. But, okay, cool. And so what I did in the NAACP kept board minutes for each month that the association met. They met 11 times out of the year. And what I did is for each month where they mentioned areas that we tend to associate with civil rights, criminal justice, and that's very much racial violence. So when they talked about mob violence and lynchings, I categorized it under criminal justice. Education, labor, and voting. And one of the things that's really interesting for me, at least in the beginning part of the NAACP's existence, is that the NAACP is really interested in issues of criminal justice, racial violence, and lynchings. This changes. I have another graph later on if I even have time to get there, but it changes after 1930s. And that's obviously when they get a big grant from the Garland Fund and go after segregated education. But again, the NAACP is really interested in this issue around racial violence. I often use this quote at one of the NAACP board meetings. One of the white founders, because we all know the board is right, it's all white except for Du Bois initially. One of the white founders asked, why are we pursuing other issues such as voting and housing segregation? And at the time, another board member, Roy Nash, says, all the American Negro wants, this is a quote, all the American Negro wants is a chance to live without a rope around his neck. And this was the idea that before African Americans fought for other rights, that they actually had to fight for the right to live, right? That this ultimately was the first civil right. All right, yes. Bam, bam. Okay, so I'm gonna speed through this. Do I have 5 minutes? 7 minutes? Okay. So one of the things that I'm gonna try to speed through is what the NAACP does in the first quarter of the 20th century, but very much formalizes in 1916 as a campaign against racial violence. And they do this and they focus on public opinion as well as the 3 branches in government. And so really, and initially, but what I try to do in the book here, and this is again influenced by scholars' work here at the University of Chicago, is to think about the precursors to the NAACP. Right, and so what obviously emerges in terms of in thinking about the fight around racial violence, the Black Lives Matter movement, I always, for me, it's important to historicize that around the work of Ida B. Wells. And here she is, right at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century, realizing and doing these really important lynching investigations, right? And kind of throwing light on the idea that the reason why African Americans are lynched is not because Black men rape white women, it's because of a number of different issues, many relating to economic progress in the Black community. And so what is unfortunate, of course, is that Ida B. Wells is initially a part of one of the first organizing meetings for the NAACP, but this is obviously a much longer story, but specific tensions and jealousies center around Du Bois not wanting Wells to be a part and other members not wanting Wells to be a part of the founding group at the NAACP. So she's ultimately not a part of the NAACP when it is founded, but it's important to understand that the NAACP's battle and struggle for 2 decades is very much dependent and it is a part of that longer legacy. All right, next slide. All right, so the first way in which they try to fight racial violence here is to do work in the public sphere. And they're like, if we can reach the hearts and minds of people, of white Americans, then people will see how unjust lynching is and everything will change, right? And they did this through Print Media, The Crisis magazine, which is of course the NAACP's organ that Du Bois is at the helm of, pamphlet publications, newspapers, and it's fascinating in terms of the number of individuals at the NAACP that really believe that if they could just get the story out there, then people would change. Obviously, that's not true. Next slide. This is last year, July of 2017, marked the 100th anniversary of the silent protest parade. Google had a little doodle for it. But the silent protest parade was part of the NAACP's campaign against racial violence, and it was that 10,000 African-American men, women, and children marched down Fifth Ave in New York City. Up until that point in American history, it's the largest demonstration of African-Americans, and they protested the racial violence and the lack of government protection of Black lives. Next slide. All right, look at these two. Oh my goodness. All right, this is when we're gonna very quick. You guys are like, why do you have Wilson up here, Megan? I know. Just very quickly, the NAACP realized that they needed to actually work also inside the political branches. In their first forum, and this is always fascinating to me, something that I have not yet come to terms with, but they are determined to reach Wilson and then Warren G. Harding. And they want to get Wilson and then Warren G. Harding to make a statement against lynching, a belief that if the president makes a statement against lynching, then the rest of the nation will follow. Surprisingly, and after a lot of work, they are able to meet with Wilson in the White House. He supposedly, at least according to James Weldon Johnson, listens to them, hears them, and then ultimately does make a statement against lynching. Warren G. Harding is an interesting individual, in part because he's always considered as one of the worst presidents of American history. Oftentimes now, with this president that we now have, he gets compared to Harding, which I think is totally wrong. But I think one of the important things is to keep in mind is, it's interesting about what lens we look through to understand political progress and who's a great president and who's not. Harding was somebody who was actually really, at a number of different points, interested in meeting with Black leaders. He met with the NAACP 5 times before he assumed office, and then many times afterwards in the Oval Office. Next slide. Congress, there's a lot of work to try to pass an anti-lynching bill to try to basically have sanctions against those accused of lynching. It's fascinating to me in the sense that what happens is that it does pass the House of Representatives in this historic vote in which you have African Americans on in the rafters, like cheering and applauding, and then, not obviously, but it unfortunately dies in committee in the Senate. Next slide. So, executive branch, no formal protections. Congress, no formal protections. They then move their energy and focus on courts. And one of the interesting things here, of course, is that the courts and the law for the NAACP, at least when the organization began, was not the first point of entry in fighting civil rights. It was, I think it was one of the things that's interesting, it was actually the last institution that they focused on, and that the state courts failed to correct the wrong. If true as alleged, make the trial absolutely void. And this is the, okay, what minute, I know. All right, you can just forward to there's a graph, next slide. And I know you can't really see this, so I'll just talk a little bit and then I will talk for 30 seconds and then close. What the NAACP does after this is it realizes the value of litigation to pursue civil rights, equality, in American society. After the case Moore v. Dempsey, it expands its legal work tremendously. It believes that perhaps these other institutions won't provide a way forward for African Americans, but perhaps courts actually will. What I think a focus on the NAACP does, at least during this period, it draws attention to the ability of African American political actors, again, to shift legal institutions in a direction they were not initially willing to go. What happens, and this is the last point that I'll make here, you can't see this very well, but just try to believe me here, is that the NAACP post-1930 then moves to an increased focus on education. One of the reasons why I believe it does so is because of the Garland Fund, and I think that questions around funding the nonprofit industrial complex and the co-opting of organizations as they pursue liberation, their dreams of what freedom and liberation might look like for people of color is something that we need to be attuned to. But I'll end there. Thank you so much.
We have about 15 minutes for questions for any of the panelists. Okay, I'll start. One of the themes in the panels is the various types of social movements within the Americas trying to face racial equality, trying to pressure the state, change state bureaucracies, change state practices. But there seems to be a lot of pushback, whether it's from, I would argue, knowing Megan's work, co-optation from NGOs or foundations on one hand, or direct, both populist, corporate, and state pushback from the racial state as well. And one of the questions that Professor Paschel asked us is, how do you break the cycle? Both from a historical perspective and a hemispheric perspective, how can these movements against racial equality make longer lasting gains, particularly in the context of increasingly, as Professor Gonzalez talks about, increasingly authoritarian regimes throughout the hemisphere, in fact, throughout the world.
Is it possible to go back to my slideshow? I don't want to do that to answer this question, I think. So I think one of the things we have to ask in all these cases is, what is the law and what is it meant to do? Can you go to the extra slides at the end? So I think one of the things that became blatantly clear, and it's clear to anybody who studies Latin American states at all, but I think it's actually true in the case of the US too, is to kind of think about the law as like an instrument, but not as the thing to be gained, right? You know, there's an expression in Brazilian Portuguese, tem lei que pega e lei que não pega. There's laws that stick, there are laws that don't stick. In Colombia, people often say that there are more laws than Colombians, which is probably true. And so there is a colloquial understanding of the limits of the law. At the same time, people believe in the law, people live through the law, and the kinds of subjectivities that get created through legal changes, I think, are more intractable than the law itself, right? And so one of the things that I am trying to do with this new project is to think critically about what beyond the law does the law produce, right? Beyond like even contention. And so one of the things that I'm seeing with my kind of media discourse analysis, if you could go to the next slide, is that one of the really amazing things that the law and the politicization of Blackness and Black mobilization in Latin America that creates these laws, right, that helps to create these laws has produced is a profoundly different way to talk about Latin American societies. So this is a slide from a mainstream newspaper in Brazil, and it just basically is just a descriptive analysis of how many times it mentions the word racism over time, right? And I do this for a lot of different newspapers throughout different Latin American countries. And so you see this increase over time. You also see like these changes, obviously, in public opinion and in news and in television and other places. Can you go to the next slide? But beyond just the kind of talking about racism more, what I find most interesting is if you look at some of these sources, you also find that like the nature of the discussion around race has fundamentally changed in Latin American countries, and especially in the case of Brazil. So in the like 1980s and 1990s, newspapers talked about race as like this man has a problem, he's a racist, right? Like he has a psychological condition that needs to be fixed, and it's an individual problem. And only after you get this like upsurge in Black mobilization and in legal changes do you start to see more structural analysis of racism, right? You start to see newspaper articles that cite activists, newspaper articles that cite the law, and I think really interestingly cite statistics, right? It might be some individual case of racism, but they like always zoom out, right? The other really weird finding that I'm having in this new project that says a lot about like well, what kind of change is happening, right? Is around this shift away from thinking about racism as other people's problems. So, if you could advance. So, in the early 90s in Brazil and in Colombia, most of the newspaper articles were about O.J. Simpson. No, not most of them, but a lot of them were about racism in the United States and South Africa. And so at some point you wonder, like, what kind of work is that doing, right? The fetishizing of other people's race problems. And so I'm starting to think about all those articles about race in the United States as about not about race in Latin America, and to think about the functional politics of racial comparison. And so I actually think that between that and the kind of popular mobilization that's happening throughout Brazil amongst people in favelas and other marginalized neighborhoods who didn't always mobilize with a racial consciousness, but do now with a sort of race-class intersectional kind of way of being in the world, I think there are these intractable things that make it so that this new equilibrium is not like the one before. It does not mean that it can't be co-opted into something else, but I do think that we're fundamentally in different stages when things change, even given their profound limitations.
Thank you for the really profound question. And the Latino immigrant rights movement faces co-optation from foundations in the Democratic Party. And, if you look at 2006, the immigrant rights marches, that happened without foundations, that happened without Democratic Party leadership. Those are completely grassroots movement. Now, most of the movement leadership is groomed and trained by Ford Foundation, except different foundations. So, to me, I think that the answer to how do you break the cycle is ultimately, I don't know the answer to that, but I say the way towards that answer is critical intellectual production. And again, this is where I think Mark really convinced me about the power of being an intellectual. Somos organizadores de ideas. We are organizers of ideas. And until we have real critical dialogue about what's happening in our community, about the limits of our political strategies, the electoral, the so-called grassroots, which is really bankrolled by foundations these days, we gotta have those debates. And that takes intellectual courage because you have to break the mold of, like in our case, traditional Latino politics, which can't answer those questions. So if you're just worried about tenure, then you can do traditional work so you can get a job at R1 and get a tenure. Then you're not asking those questions. So it takes intellectual courage. It takes the organizing of ideas in order to ask the big questions of how do we get out of this vicious cycle of repression, mobilization, co-optation. We gotta ask those questions. And that, I think that's really our role.
One thing I would add to that, and I think this is, Mark was a shining example. Those of us who have tenure and have access to resources have increased responsibility to take that role and provide cover for junior college graduate students and activists who don't have the resources and protections that we have. Absolutely. Adam?
Okay. Is this on? Okay. So thank you very much for the panel, and I just wanted maybe to ask you all to zoom out and think a bit about the title of the panel and the nature of the political crisis we're living in. And Michael talked about it as a legitimation crisis of some kind. And from your talks, I heard maybe two accounts of what constitutes that crisis. So one being a kind of backlash narrative, right? A story about the ways in which the right is responding to particular kinds of gains from a liberal rights regime. And then a second story about the crisis of capitalism and the ways in which the crisis itself fuels maybe not backlash, but creates the conditions for a particular kind of reactionary regime. And so I just wondered if you could think about maybe how those stories are different or go together in some way, or if there are other ways you might characterize the crisis.
I think we're going to take I'm going to ask to take 2 or 3 questions, and the panel will have a chance to respond to all of them.
Thanks, this was a really great panel. So my question is for everyone, but it was inspired by the second talk, in part because I was thinking about the relationship between state, economy, and society, or civil society. And, there's been a lot about the carceral state. And one of the things that I've been thinking about is sort of the rise of a carceral class. So we talk about, fees and fines, but there's a whole group of people now who profit off of, who have jobs, legitimized by the state. So the rise of police that you talked about, the rise of border control enforcement. And I'm just wondering if you can sort of expand and think about those who profit off of these systems, and to think about this across race too, because it's not just, minority policing is something that is part of this, where it intersects across race and thinking about this carceral class.
Any other questions?
Thank you for the panel also. I have like a graduate student type of question. One of the things that really, that I identified across the presentations was the commitment to a sort of work in political science that spans across subfields, that is, theoretically informed and qualitatively driven. And one of the things that is often difficult about that work is sort of forming the early stages, forming the project, right? If you're doing an ethnographic project, it's hard to identify what the question or quote unquote hypothesis or something is of the project in order to get the project legitimated and then to go into the field. So I guess the question is how do you sort of, what is the process, the early stages of crafting a project where you don't know what you're going to find in the archive, or you don't really know what you're going to find in an ethnographic field, and what that means for the type of questions you ask at, in the beginning.
So my question is oriented more towards Megan's. I've had a chance over the years to look at the NAACP archives as well in the Library of Congress, and as you know, they're enormous. And just to say that there's lots there and more to be done. But I guess I would wonder about, so I need to do some more reading. The conclusions you talked about, namely the Darling Fund's impact on the NAACP and the Legal Defense Fund and the direction it chose to go, as to whether, having looked at some of those, you know that there are lots of, there's lots of correspondence on racism and racial discrimination and specific encounters that people have in simply Maryland, Louisiana, and so forth. So what you've done is a quantitative analysis of what kinds of things got addressed at the board level, but there's lots of information and lots of communications coming in from throughout the country about these issues. So I'm wondering about whether, whether you looked at some of those other communications. It's not a very focused question, and it's directly related to Marcus's question. But partly you have to kind of jump into it and start swimming around and see what you can find as part of the answer to Marcus. But so if you can offer some comments about how you navigated that enormous array of materials that are in that archives.
So we have 4 questions about various forms of reaction and crisis, rise of profiteers from the carceral state, process of crafting a project, and then a question about the archive, the basic the archive. So I'll turn it over to the stage, guys.
All right. So Diane, I'm going to try to address your question. Hopefully within that I can also partially address Marcus's question. I did not, sometimes my graduate students ask me this question around how do you know when you found something in the archives? And perhaps Alfonso or Tianna may say something different. I don't always know. I just go digging. I'm broadly interested, very broadly, in the role of Black mobilization in political and legal development at the federal level, for me. And so when I see something that might look like that. I like pull at that string, and sometimes things unravel, or other days you go to the Library of Congress for a week and there's nothing, right? And other times you're like, go live, right? So I go with broad questions about like specific groups of people, but the wrong thing to say is that you know when you know, but sometimes you might know. And one of my things that have been really helpful actually is to have a group of senior colleagues and then junior colleagues that I can bounce ideas off. So sometimes I'll be like, no, Megan, you're going down the wrong track. But that has been helpful. Diane, to address your question, so I actually was interested, I wasn't at all interested in the Garland Fund and or why the NAACP did not pursue or pursued education. In writing the last chapter of my book, and I was very familiar, right, with the NAACP's campaign against education, right? So, and I was aware of who the Garland Fund was. Anybody who does legal history is. But the Garland Fund came up 3 times in the Morby Dempsey case. And it's because they funded a tiny part of that litigation as well as one of the ads to advertise actually what actually happened. And so I began to get really interested in it. As I was writing the conclusion for my book, I started to dig a little bit more. So I went to the Garland Fund, for those who don't know, is it underwrote all of the NAACP's education effort, and their real name is the American Fund for Public Service, but their archives are in New York at the New York Public Library, and so I took a trip there to try to figure out what in the world was going on. So when I did that, I realized that there was actually this much larger story about how the American Fund for Public Service was this radical philanthropy of like white radicals really interested in funding the labor movement in the 1920s and 1930s in this country. And so they funded all these different radical labor organizations. And for them, and the reason why now we know them as funding, as making sure, basically underwriting Brown v. Board, is that they get really excited about Morby Dempsey. They're like, the NAACP is able to do so much with so little, right? They compare them to the ACLU. They're like, they call the ACLU a spendthrift bunch of wastrels. This is a quote. They're like, NAACP is able to get results. So they like that idea. The NAACP, and this is the reason why, I mean, this is actually right now an article that is finally under an R&R. And it actually goes into much larger detail. The short of it, essentially, and it's taken me, I started the article in 2012, and it's taken me a long time to sift through a tremendous amount of NAACP archive work and American Fund for Public Service. But basically, the Garland Fund wants the NAACP to go after the big ideas for the Garland Fund are education and labor. The NAACP is super consumed with racial violence, lynching, and mob violence. Moving forwards after Morby Dempsey, the Garland Fund is like, you know what? We are uninspired by the success of these groups that we fund around labor. We are going to propose this idea about the NAACP should pursue a litigation campaign against education. Walter White, Du Bois, and James Weldon Johnson all fought back in different forms of communication. They were like, we really think that the next frontier for equal rights for African Americans is through fighting jury discrimination, racial lynchings, and mob violence. And you have this like fascinating exchange basically where Walter White is like, I don't want to do this. And Morris Ernst from the Garland Fund is like, you need to write this letter and send this like basically fake request to us, right? And so he does that. Fast forward in my next 30 seconds, they get this initially $100,000 grant, which of course is then cut because of the Great Depression. Many people ascribe this to the NAACP because Du Bois in 1925 had this whole education investigation, but it really is, I mean, what happens later on is this like interesting contestation in the way in which we have looked back on this history, and I believe in so many ways written our beliefs about how civil rights actually should look like onto the past. And so what I do is I try to problematize that a lot through this work. So.
In response to the first 2 questions about the relationship between the crisis of legitimacy and the crisis of capitalism, they're dialectically related. Neoliberalism has created massive inequality. It required the continued thrust behind capital accumulation requires massive deregulation of environmental regulations It requires massive privatization. It must constantly grow. And eventually, you cannot build consent for those things. You know, when neoliberalism emerged in Mexico and Latin America, it was very consensual. There was all this fanfare about how this was going to be our way towards democratization. Well, nadie les cree ahora, right? No one believes that anymore. Even here in the US, no one believes that. But we can't shake the model. So the model has lost legitimacy, and you have these authoritarian forms of governments to keep the model alive, the neoliberal model alive, without consent. So it's domination without consent. And that's what's scary. That's what's scary. As far as the political economy of policing, absolutely, that's a major issue. You know, in Texas, all the private, I was at UT Austin for 2 years, and I did my research at the detention centers and immigration court there, and in California. And if you look at where the detention centers are at in Texas and where they're in California, they're in rural Latino communities, and the vast majority of the guards are Latinos. In Adelanto, Victorville, it's gonna be blacks and Latinos, but still more Latinos. You go to South Texas, all of the guards are Latinos in South Texas, all of them. The federal, at the federal prisons, but also the private prisons. But you know, the profiting doesn't just come from sort of the police apparatus, it also comes from the immigration lawyers. It also comes from people who are helping the immigrant rights establishment, bankrolled by major foundations. I mean, that's part of it. Even us as scholars who write about this, right? We're indirectly making a career about these things too. So that's part of it, right? And I think we need to really, that's why we have to, in REP and Latino politics, which we have to think about questions of political economy. Because if we don't ask those questions, we're never going to confront these major contradictions and issues.
So yesterday I talked a little bit about how Mark was boastful, we can call it, extremely confident, and how he used that in a collective way. One of the ways that I only realized later when I was on the job market that Mark had trained me to be, as a scholar, as a social scientist, was really audacious when it came to methods, and that's to answer Marcus's question. So Mark never didn't ask a question that he was interested in because of some limitations of method, right? He asked the questions that moved him, that he thought were the most urgent questions, and he mastered the tools to answer those questions. And that's why his work is, you know, uses survey data, uses interview data, uses ethnographic data, uses archival data, builds theory, right? And I hadn't realized until I was on the market how crazy that is as a way of being in academia, because I do the same thing. I ask questions, and people are like, "Oh, you are a historical sociologist, or you are an ethnographer." I am, but I also am just somebody who wants deeply to know things and to solve things. And so I think one of the beautiful things, but also one of the hard things about that is just to follow your intuition, but also master those tools, you know, and don't let the tools be the limit. Don't have a tool that you need to put on a question. You know what I mean? I think all too often we do that, and I don't think that that's the kind of research that moves anything forward, per se. Maybe in more smaller increments, but not in big ways. In terms of thinking about Adon's amazing question, I think also to echo Alfonso, I think it's completely dialectical, and I think in the case of Latin American governments and the economic crisis that's happening, you know, the kind of move left and its power to really bring about unprecedented redistribution in Latin America was premised on certain kind of models of capital accumulation. It was premised on a denial of all kinds of environmental justice issues, and it was premised on really banking on exports. And so the commodities boom is why you get so much redistribution in Latin America over the last 15 years. But the commodities bust is why everybody has had to reset. And I think one of the things that's really interesting that Kimberly's question brings up are the material and the symbolic class politics that all of these cycles kind of bring up. And so one of the things that I think is crucial to be studied is to kind of rethink how we have studied, if we've studied at all, Latin American elites. Because the extent to which people do study elites in Latin America is not through a critical lens, and it's certainly not through any kind of racial lens. And I think that one of the most fascinating things about this recent kind of period, is most marked in the Brazilian case, because I think Brazilian social anxieties are like lived through so much popular culture. So like on novellas and movies, you see, this anxiety of like the upper middle class of Brazil, who gained a lot with the commodities boom, but who lost a lot symbolically with that same boom, right? So all these anxieties about having to sit next to your empregado or your domestic worker on an airplane, God forbid, or not being able to find a good worker, not being able to find a gardener, right? And so I actually think that there are these interesting ways that we actually have to we need to do more ethnographies of the top. I don't know that in this case we would call it the carceral state, but maybe, right? Or the carceral class, but to kind of think more critically about whiteness in Latin America, and to do some work that we're only at the beginning of.
I'll take moderator's privilege to make the last comment, and it's building a lot off what everybody else has said already. One of the, I think, lessons that that Mark was a little resistant to at first was the classics also matter, but I think he embraced that. And thinking about Adam's question, two books that aren't read enough any longer, Race and Class in the Southwest by Mario Borrero, and James Boggs' Racism and the Class Struggle. Both point to, many decades ago, the type of tensions between a racial order and a capitalist order that we now see manifesting in populist reaction that's also married to the type of pushback from capitalist elites and the racial state that people have already described. We can also, by going back to the classics, we can also find out a lot more about what's going on today than we sometimes suspect. And let's thank the panel for a wonderful discussion, and we'll be back in about 10 minutes.